Chapter 8. The next morning, Alan sat on the brick floor of their makeshift kitchen eating breakfast. Baba and Robert sat next to him. As soon as he had finished his plate of dal, chapatis, and yogurt, Kadam was there, ready to serve more. "You're going to get me fat," Alan said, smiling, as Kadam hurried back to his cooking. For a few minutes, they all ate in contented silence. Then Baba glanced over at Alan. "You sell yourself so cheap," Baba said, and in that instant the beauty of the morning vanished. "What are you talking about?" Alan replied, trying to keep his anger in check. "No, Grandpa, I haven't met anyone special here. Give me one of your corn-fed American girls any day," Baba said in a spot-on imitation of Alan's call to America. "I was just joking," Alan replied hotly, mad that the yogi had overheard his conversation. "You don't deserve her," Baba said. "Fuck you!" Alan shouted, suddenly enraged. "You talk about being spiritual and then listen in on my private conversation? That's bullshit!" Alan wanted Baba to react, so Alan could then really yell at him. But what the yogi did next truly infuriated him. Baba just stretched his arms over his head, as though he was lazily rising from sleep. Then he glanced over at Robert. "Remember, there are 3 types of spiritual teachers. One caters to your ego. The second goes parallel to it, seeking some moment to confront. But the third busts your ego, morning, noon, and night. Unfortunately, I'm of the latter." Alan was thinking of a reply when Lords entered the room. "Aunt Lords!" Robert exclaimed, getting up and giving her a hug. "Morning to you all," she said behind her darkly tinted glasses. She had slept terribly, her jet lag finally beginning to kick in. "Let me introduce you to the gang," Robert said. "Baba, this is my Aunt Lords." "Very glad to meet you," Baba said, rising to shake her hand. "I've heard a lot of good things about you," Lords replied, taking stock of her enemy. He was taller than she had imagined, which she didn't like. He also had on a ruby ring, which really bothered her. She hated jewelry on men, hated this benighted country, and hated the way the ground kept moving underneath her. Still, she put forward her most smiling self. "And this is Alan Hennessy," Robert added. "Oh, I know your family," she said. "I've even interviewed your hard-to-reach grandfather. The senator and your Aunt Paloma I've known since college. Now I get to meet you, in the most unlikely place." "Small world," Alan commented, feeling his anger starting to subside. "You go to town," Baba instructed Alan. "Get the cement, and we'll entertain our honored guest here." "All right," Alan replied, sighing. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Marty." As Alan walked down toward the Ganges, he thought about what Baba had said. He knew the reason he had become so enraged was because Baba's remarks had been correct. He had demeaned his relationship with Ronnie to his grandfather. Alan knew it as soon as he said it. He had just been trying to act like the typical Hennessy man, macho, promiscuous, careless in love. That he didn't fit that mode anymore was something Alan was acutely aware of. He walked along, thinking of Ronnie. He could feel the strength of their bond even more in her absence. He wanted to believe that she was still around him, hovering like some kind of astral bodyguard. In any case, he had wanted to see her, but their situation now seemed quite hopeless. Thinking about their relationship depressed him. So he decided to cheer himself up by seeing Lord Krishna. Right by the banks of the Ganges was a 30-foot-high platform with a statue of Krishna driving his chariot. Alan had gone there before with Ronnie and had enjoyed sitting there, watching the water of the Ganges go by. He walked over to the site and sat down underneath the charioteer. He then closed his eyes and began to meditate. A few minutes later, he heard his name being called. He opened his eyes and saw it was Ronnie, sitting on her light green Vespa scooter, smiling at him. "I was just thinking of you," he exclaimed, running over to her. "Soft landing," he said, pressing his cheek against hers. "Soft landing," she responded in their traditional greeting. Let's go behind the post, Ronnie added, referring to the wide supports that held up the platform. I'm with the samurai. The bodyguard? He asked. Yeah, Papa won't let me come into town unless I'm with him. He knows you're with Baba. Is this all hopeless? Alan asked, as Ronnie peered around the post. You mean us? She asked, as Alan nodded back. I don't know, she said, smiling. Maybe somehow. Ronnie, Alan said, thinking about his earlier run-in with Baba. What do you do when you blow it with your spiritual teacher? Pardon? She asked, her eyes darting round the corner. I blew it with Baba. I told him to fuck off. She laughed, but then stopped when she saw Alan's discomfort. Well, what do I do? He persisted. She thought for a moment and then answered, You sacrifice your ego at the altar of the teacher. What does that mean? He asked, hearing the bodyguard calling Ronnie's name in the distance. She bit down on her lip. Bring him water. Water from the Ganges. Now, stay here, she whispered, stepping out from the pillar. Hi, Samurai, she called out. Where were you? The bodyguard asked testily. Oh, Samurai, Ronnie exclaimed, taking him by the arm and leading him back to the scooters. Can't I even make my obeisance to Mata Ganges in private? I guess so. Just don't tell your father that you got out of my sight or I'm in trouble. No problemo, Ronnie casually responded as they started up their Vespas. Alan waited behind the post until they were gone. Then he walked across the bridge that spanned the Ganges and bought 2 chrome buckets and some bags of cement in the commercial part of town. After that, he got a tunga to take him to Chotiwala. It was near sundown, but Bertie and the boys were still hanging around the restaurant. Bertie, would you ride this up to the ashram for me? Alan asked, gesturing to the bags in the back of the tunga. Pay the piper and it's done, Bertie replied. Been slow today. Alan shook his head, putting some currency in Bertie's hand. Win-win for everyone, right? Bertie enthused. More like a shakedown, Bertie, but that's okay. Bertie said something, but Alan was already heading for the Ganges with his pails. Once he got there, he waded out far enough to scoop up some water into the buckets. After that, he began his trudge back home. The day was turning into night, and after half an hour, his arms began to feel like they were separating from their sockets. Alan thought about emptying them out a little, but he shook his head. If he was going to do this thing, he was going to do it right. By the time he reached the turnoff for the ashram, it was dark, his palms were blistered, and his muscles were in spasm, but he kept walking, trying not to spill any of the water on the path. Finally, he made his way over to the fire pit where Baba was sitting with the others, and put the buckets in front of him. This is for you. My apology. Baba contemplated Alan by the glint of the fire. Take this, Baba said, handing Alan a metal cup. Water the trees and bushes all around. Alan stood motionless before him, too exhausted and confused to move. Go, Baba exclaimed, pointing to the trees around them. They are waiting for you. Alan walked over to a large tree and began scooping the water out of the bucket onto the bark, making it look all glazed in the light. Baba watched him and felt time and space disappear. He remembered himself watering the same tree at the order of his teacher. It had been Baba's first punishment for abusing the occult powers. His teacher had ordered that he fetch water from the Ganges every day and water the vegetation around the ashram. Baba gazed at Alan watering the tree, his aura so clouded by darkness and tragedy, and saw himself.